So we're starting our second batch, and I'll just turn things over to Catherine to moderate the panel.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And I'm Catherine Skinner. I'm the Executive Director of Educopia Institute. And I want to start with just a tremendous thanks, especially to IMLS for hosting this event. And I hope it will be as influential as the one was last year, as many people have noted. The conversation that we had here last year was a rich one. It went in some directions that really needed to be spoken out loud, and it did have an effect, and I think that's fantastic. So the core question that this panel has been asked to discuss is gaps in distributed national digital capacity. So where are they? Do we seek to eradicate those gaps? Do we seek to bridge them? And if so, how? In my work, I've had the pleasure of convening and joining a lot of cross-sector conversations about this topic of late. And some of those conversations have been with libraries, but across library types. So the public libraries, the special libraries, the academic libraries, and usually the archives as well in that context. Others have been with groups that cut across other related fields, including a lot of cross-sector gatherings of libraries, museums, and archives, many of which IMLS has provided the basis for. And then still others have been with groups that are focused on a core content type, and in one that I'll call out in particular is digital news preservation, where the Reynolds Journalism Institute and Educopia have been partnering with NEH Support to enter into conversation with journalists and publishers and technologists and press associations and archivists and librarians, historical societies and researchers in order to really solve the conundrums around born digital news preservation, which we've barely even scratched the surface on yet. And then the most recent was just yesterday when I joined the Global Summit of Internet 2 and heard the perspectives of college presidents, CIOs, technologists, and also some community leaders that work with groups like K-12 education, public libraries, et cetera, through the UCAN program. And I'll note that, you know, across all of those events and many others, and across all of those different groups, the concerns that we have and that we're talking about today in regards to gaps in our national digital capacity are shared by many, many others in this extended environment or ecosystem, if you will, in which we operate. I also want to raise two important questions before I turn it over to this able panel, ones that I know all of us will be discussing over the next hour. The first is our national digital capacity hindered by gaps in infrastructure, or is it hindered by gaps in relationship, knowledge, and facilitation? And I'll show my hand on this one. I believe it's the latter. I worry about the cliques that we have in our environment right now. I worry that we aren't nearly polyamorous enough to borrow from Dan and also from Jim. And an important word that I've had yet to hear today and that I want to encourage us to talk more about in this panel and hopefully for the rest of the day is facilitation. Because facilitation, active facilitation, is absolutely necessary for alignment. It doesn't happen by magic. So without active facilitation, system-wide change might happen, but it won't involve the myriad voices and perspectives that we need in order to build a national digital platform that actually serves our national digital needs. So let me say that again. System-wide change may happen, but it's going to privilege the loudest, most prominent voices unless active facilitation of extended communities is part of this picture. And that brings me to the second question. How does our national digital capacity relate to our business and to our mission? And I don't ask this lightly. As some of you know, my background is in sociology and American studies, and my research interests have always tended towards the inception of new fields and the transformation of existing fields. How do those processes happen? How do innovations come and have an impact? And how do networks of people bring those from the fringes to the center of a field? And are there ways that we can actually use that set of techniques to our advantage? And I'm going to turn to a canonical example today, one that was featured in Harvard Business Review more than half a century ago, but it's still extremely relevant to our conversation today. It's a piece called Marketing Myopia, and it was by Theodore Levitt. And in it, he asked why growth industries stop growing. And he challenged the notion that it's because a market becomes saturated. He says really simply that growth industries stop growing because the top players in the industry forget or they misdefine their mission and their market. As a poignant illustration of this, he points to the railroad industry and claims that the railroad industry didn't lose its prominence in the field because of a decrease in the need for passenger and freight transportation. Those things actually grew. Nor did it decline because the field became saturated with cars and transfer trailers and all the other types of planes, et cetera. Instead, it declined because the railroad industry stopped filling the need that was there. They let others take away customers from them because they assumed that they were in the railroad industry, not the transportation industry. They defined their industry too narrowly. And if instead of believing their business was railroad, they had recognized that their business was transportation, they would have expanded to meet the customer demand that was clearly there. So what is our business? What are we building national digital capacity for? And who will it serve? Libraries, archives, and museums, is that what we're here to talk about? Or users? And which users? Scholars? The public? Who? Our panelists will begin today by talking about the need for better stakeholder investment and coordination, better understanding of our goals, not just at the institution level, but at the system level. They will discuss and they will shed light on gaps at multiple sites and levels. So gaps in function, where are the tools that are missing? What content types are lagging behind? Gaps between tools. So maybe we've got BitCurator and Archivematica and Archive Space, but how do we actually link those together? How do we use those to build real workflows? Gaps between institutions. How do we build more networks, less silos? Gaps between fields. So how do we work with others in similar spaces, especially museums and archives, which I know Seb will especially talk about. They'll also talk about what opportunities arise when we work to fill those gaps. So let me now transition to introduce those panelists, mostly for the benefit of our extended audience, because I don't think any of these people need any introduction in this room. Clifford Lynch has led the Coalition for Networked Information since 1997, CNI. Mike Furlow is the executive director of HathiTrust, and he's also the author of the On Furlow blog, though I don't think he has enough time to work on that so much anymore. No. Seb Chan is the director of digital and emerging media at the Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, and he's also the co-founder of Cyclical Defrost, which, if there are any music fans out here, you should really check out his past music history. And he's also a longtime blogger. And Karen Cariani is the director of WGBH Media Library and Archives at the WGBH Educational Foundation. So join me now in welcoming these panelists, and we're going to transition to Cliff, and we're going to go down the row.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to start with just a couple of words about how I think about this whole question of national platform. The term makes me, as some others, a little uneasy because it has overtones of centralization. And really what we're dealing with here is more of a program or a portfolio of services and of organizations that deliver and support those services, I think. And the magic here is how we make that portfolio reasonably comprehensive and, above all, coherent and cohesive to allow these various services to complement each other. I think when you think about it like that, you recognize that there really is an enormous wealth of services, some of them quite technical, some of them really operating at a higher level, although they may imply technical infrastructure, that need to be part of this world of managing, preserving, and providing access to all of the material that we're interested in. And I'm just going to throw out, 4 or 5 examples really quickly to get people thinking about how diverse these services may be and some of the places we perhaps haven't been thinking enough. I do want to also note, by way of framing, that one of the other things we see is we've got a lot of capabilities that are parked inside of institutions, but that we don't reuse well as a community. Because people can't find them or they're not set up to provide services to others. So there's a great deal of replication that seems to happen, and I think part of the strategy here is to build on expertise rather than attempt to replicate it all over the place because it's just too expensive. So here are just a few examples. We clearly need a lot more management of names and identities of all kinds than we have today. Institutional identifiers, archival names, the sort of work that Dan Pitty and his colleagues are trying to bring forward with the SNAC project, names that cross between performing arts, museums, libraries in the world of texts. That is an enormous collective enterprise which has been stovepiped horrendously and is now starting to converge, and we need to figure out how to collectively contribute to that convergence. There's a tremendous amount of orphan material that we're all trying to deal with, things that are maybe in the public domain, maybe we can't find who owns the rights. We actually have some institutions with great expertise there, but we haven't somehow opened up this process very effectively. Related to that, but actually going far beyond it, there are a number of things that lend themselves to crowdsourcing. Everything from proofreading of OCR to identifying photographs and tracking down rights on things. We don't have a mechanism that's very good for talking to the public broadly, for asking for help and saying, if you take up challenges from these particular places, this will contribute to the whole infrastructure and the collective cultural material that's available. Archiving on demand for small places. Brokerage of where can I put things for preservation, who helps to take care of things like this for institutions who can't. Very important. Last one that I'll throw out, and this is I think really important. Institutions have banded together in the physical world to some extent to do disaster recovery. When there is a flood or a fire, people come together and work on that, try and recover precious materials that may have been damaged. We need a sort of a emergency response team for digital disasters. And digital disasters come in many flavors, ranging from security problems where you lose control of content, to economic problems, or just stupidity problems where someone decides to shut down a site because they're tired of it or can't afford it without looking into who's going to take successor responsibility or might like to for the site. The Internet Archive has done some wonderful work in this area. I'm thinking of the GeoCities problem, for example, an archive team's response to that. We need to do this on a national scale, and this is part of dealing with the digital world. So my point, particularly in mentioning that one, is that that is an organizational thing as much as anything else, but it's vital to have these in our portfolio of services that make up this national platform that we're speaking of. I'm done.
So we need to fill the gaps of stupidity.
Response
to stupidity, right?
Endemic.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about restricted access to materials that for some reason may not be fully accessible to as many people as we might like. At HathiTrust, we do have a deep commitment to public good. We've had funding from, benefited from funding from IMLS for years to undertake rights determinations. We've opened about 250,000 volumes, found them to be in the public domain. All very, very important work to do. But we need to find more ways to lawfully and productively work with materials that have restrictions of some sort. This is stuff that we might not be able to redistribute beyond a particular user community for various reasons. There are a lot of challenges in addressing this in 5 minutes because there are a lot of different reasons why you might need to restrict access, and there are a lot of technological, cultural, and policy issues at play here. So I'm just going to try to highlight a few things. Restricted access might have to do with copyright, one we're all fairly familiar with. We know that the 20th century is increasingly harder to study because of the inability to get access to cultural artifacts of the 20th century. There are certainly exceptions to this in libraries that we can make, and we have to know how to use them intelligently. We know that we live in a world of licensing. now. This is not likely to change. Publishers are going to be continuing to aggregating significant amounts of content and making it accessible to libraries for their users for a cost, not always at the terms we would want. There are also other reasons, gaps in knowledge, right? So in special collections, and I think Susan Gibbons brought this up last year, we may have gift agreements that do not clearly document the provenance of a collection or what was intended for the contributors of the collection. It may be materials that are documenting the lives of living people, and which might need, therefore, to have some restrictions upon them. And that brings us to one more, which has to do with privacy and sensitive materials, that we are increasingly seeing users in our universities generate material that may contain sensitive information that might be protected under law or just simply for ethical reasons. So there are all the uses we want to make of this stuff, or all the uses we would make of anything. Preservation for future use, or simply reading and viewing, or access for populations with special needs, such as the users who have print disabilities or are visually impaired. But there's also emerging needs, such as computational uses of material that we might label non-consumptive, and we can talk about that later. It's not the case that we can't work with this stuff now. We know how to do it in some limited circumstances. Libraries license electronic collections all the time. We have authentication systems, or to grant access. We might only provide access in specific locations or to specific IP ranges. But for material that we have in our collections, or that we are collecting ourselves or creating ourselves, we don't necessarily have good capacities to manage that material, and not just manage it in the sense of store it and stick it away, but make it useful to individuals. So there are technological solutions that are in the space that already are deployed towards this, right? Identity management and authentication, encryption, or emulation. But this isn't really necessarily about creating new technologies so much as it might be about scaling capacity to use them. So there are a few other issues I'll highlight here. User experience issues. How do we make material accessible and useful in these kinds of curtailed environments, and convey to our users meaningfully the terms in which they have to operate? Expertise issues, knowledge of these issues in our libraries, right, or among our users. Consider in the humanities, for example, linguists who may wish to use audio and video recordings for linguistic analysis, recordings that may actually have been conducted in recorded for social science experiments under a very particular research protocol, and were never envisioned for reuse by other users down the path. So that brings us to one more, institutional policies. Our institutions have to balance multiple legal regimes and risk analyses here. It's not just copyright, but in higher education, you're talking about FERPA. In a lot of cases, you're talking about HIPAA as well. We have in universities a lot of experience in mitigating disclosure and risk for student data, or for other data that we collect for business purposes, or for research studies with a very particular research protocol. But we don't have a lot of experience thinking about preservation and then reuse of that data, or at least our universities, I think, don't in that context. And then lastly, I'll just highlight one more issue, the need to balance the protection of privacy for our patrons with the need to securely identify a user with particular privileges. Passing attributes through authentication mechanisms is something that is often necessary to do, but it makes us uncomfortable if we're passing certain kinds of mechanisms, and how does that material get stored? I think in libraries we're awfully, and archives and museums, awfully conflicted about our role in collecting this personal information, and many of our conversations on this are limited by a lack of nuance. And so I hope we can find further ways of doing it. So the last comment I'll make here, no question, our digital infrastructure needs to be developed and designed around principles of openness and linking and sharing. Our advocacy has to be focused on broad access and on issues such as copyright reform. But developing infrastructure for services using restricted content is not about building barriers. It's not really about breaking them down so much as it's about making them permeable for legitimate reasons. So to better support all users in this conversation, we have to think about impact not simply as how many eyeballs or how much stuff can we deliver, but how much or whether who or what could be served that we're not meeting right now. So I'll stop with that.
I guess I'm coming from the museum space, and I'm coming from a museum that's been closed for the last 3.5 years. We opened in December, and in that period we had to think about what it would be like to have a physical space, whilst everything should also be available digitally. And I think it's important that a digital platform doesn't ignore the physical resources that we have in our communities, and perhaps the need to reconfigure those resources, those public library buildings, to better work with the digital platform. Some of the work in Australia that's been going on around that in the local government space has been to merge the archive, the museum, the public library, and the art gallery in regional areas into a single building, where the library brings the regular audiences in, and the museum and the contemporary art space provide that content and those experiences to library patrons, and it forms also a digitisation hub in local communities. So that sort of sense of having a physical presence for the national digital platform that's visible to citizens is incredibly important, I think. I think some of the other stuff we've been doing at Cooper Hewitt has been looking at the ways we can build out the work we're doing on the web as a simple set of tools for others to use. And really trying to extract, manipulate, and transform data from proprietary systems, so that it can play well with others. But actually, the biggest change we've done within the Cooper Hewitt probably isn't this interactive pen that you might have heard about in the press, but it's in fact the licensing and policy shifts that have occurred beneath the surface. That means that everything in the museum, whether it's on loan or from another museum or on show from a donor, is available on our website forever, as long as you visit the museum first, which speaks to Mike's identity piece, in that sense that the national digital platform also needs an identity piece that needs to be thought about. Some of the other work we've been doing has been about thinking about as the content that designed museums collect moves away from physical stuff into media, and moving from media into services. How do we collect and preserve media? How do we collect and preserve software? We've done some initiatives releasing source code of the assets of the collection pieces we have into GitHub for exposing the difficulties of preserving them to the communities we are preserving them for. But we're also starting to think about, and I think the national digital platform should think about 10 to 20 years out from now, about what it means for libraries to collect and preserve services. What that actually means, we need to talk more about. But I think increasingly, we're not talking about texts as even solitary pieces of media, but as systems that rely on many other moving parts to be experienced. And we see some of this with emulation going on now, but we need to come up with collective ways to address that challenge. And that's probably about it for now.
Okay, hi. So I'm just back from a week of hiking in the Smoky Mountains, where all I had to worry about was putting one foot in front of the other and not fall down. I kind of feel that way every day at WGBH in this digital landscape. So I'm going to start by laying the landscape, if you will, for audiovisual challenges that hopefully will step us forward. The analog material is deteriorating quickly, particularly videotape, all analog formats. And some of it's 60 years old, some of it's only 10 years old. When it does, it will no longer be able to be seen or heard, and there's significant volume of this material that is our heritage for the last 60 years. Since even the newer analog videotape formats are no longer being creative and equipment is becoming scarce, the older content needs to be migrated to a digital file. There is a gap in this migration and digitization. It's not happening fast enough. It's expensive, it's somewhat complicated, it needs expertise technicians to do the best capture possible, since it might be the only opportunity to capture it. And often the content holders don't even know what's on the tape until it's digitized, because otherwise they can't see it. Second, born digital media is even more voluminous and complicated. The formats are numerous, the technical data to track it is complicated, and the files can be really big. It's hard to manage. The technology to create media, the cameras, are moving faster than the technology to manage and store it. At least that's what we're finding. Cameras are created and used with new file formats, higher resolution, different file organization, and naming conventions. With the big files, processing time is consuming. It takes time to ingest a big file and to move it from one storage place to another. At GBH, we figured out that for all the content we create in a year, it will take us a year of processing time to ingest it, run the checksums, create processes for viewing, and laying it down onto storage tape. And then you need to migrate. You need to do all those things for media files for preservation and access. And then you need to migrate, which is another year. And the volume of files, even the small ones, needs better tools for adding descriptive data that isn't so time-consuming. Descriptive data, metadata is one way to discover this content, but if it takes too long to attach it to the files, it won't happen. If you have to make a descriptive record for every single file that you create, it's just too many. It won't happen. We need tools for batch ingest of many files into folder structures and batch edit attach metadata to those large numbers of files. Third, preservation issues. With digital files, you need to migrate and constantly check the file every time it's moved to make sure it's still good and it's still viewable. The cost of long-term migration of digital is expensive, and it needs a high-capacity infrastructure. Smaller institutions are not set up to manage this, and the tools and software out there are mostly vendor-based, and it's expensive to maintain and evolve or keep up with the new tools and formats. I think smaller institutions tend to go with a vendor-based solution because they think everything will be taken care of for them. And the solution for long-term digital preservation really hasn't been tested yet. We don't really know what it will take. Many copies, constant checking files, always migrating, it's complicated. And finally, digital media gives us better, more universal access. You can see it on your computer. You don't need special equipment, like a video deck. But the rights issues prevent us from being able to allow universal access. So although we may have something, and it may be well described, you have to physically come to our facility to see it. Working on being able to allow broad access for just viewing, regardless of the rights involved, would be fabulous. Be it as a library and archive for scholarly access. Really pushing the fair use rights for universal access. Those rights are one barrier to sharing and why owners want control over their materials as opposed to collaborating with others. Public media stations, I think, are at the crossroads of the academic community and commercial media. I personally would love to see more collaboration across all public media in the space of open source development of technology. Public media technicians and engineers know the issues with managing media, but they don't have the resources to build management technology. We no longer have the bandwidth to really experiment in that area. They need training. We like to generally collaborate, and we have great connections into our public community. And the public media knows the importance of preserving our history. We just need help doing it because it's not our foremost mission at the moment. I'm hoping that the American Archive of Public Broadcasting can really help bridge that gap and be the conduit for that collaboration in this space. But collaboration means building trust, and that's hard. Convenings, face-to-face meetings, communication is key, and that's time-consuming and also expensive. Open source solutions like Hydra are very, very promising, but right now it's still complicated and tech heavy. We're looking forward to the Hydra out of the box and hoping that there's a really good media solution with that. Building a community solution is really promising. Hosted services as collaborative projects are promising. Collaborative long-term storage would be fabulous for media. It will take the larger institutions helping the smaller ones to really solve these issues. And money for the smaller institutions to participate in that community is also important. Breaking the work down so they can participate is important. And giving them simple tools to use that they can manage. And simple tools is, if you think it's simple, make it even simpler, because that's going to be really important.
Fabulous. All right, so transitioning out, I want to go ahead and transition to you guys and let your voices become part of the conversation. And so I will go ahead and open up questions.
Hello, I'm Marilee Kennedy, and I work at the New York Public Library. I think this is such an important topic, the gaps, and clearly there are many opportunities for us, and I expect for generations to come there will be continuing to be opportunities. I'd like to think about, because I know we are thinking about it, I know many other people are thinking about how we engage the community in the prioritization of these gaps, and how we think about how we collaboratively work with the community to meet the needs that they're feeling right now. My sense is we have to work at this from both sides, the base of what tools do we have, how do we work together to create a collaborative tech environment, but more importantly for me is the difference I'm going to be able to make in our community's life today, or at least within some reasonable amount of time, so that they're around to support us when we have really big investments to make, and they have the patience to deal with the kinds of conversations that we're having today, which are critical, but no one other than the people in these rooms may understand them. And so I'd like to put a call out for us to figure out who are our target audiences, where are the target needs in the communities that we work in, how do we open up a conversation with the community in order to prioritize what we need to do, so that together we're actually focused on the goal of improving their lives.
Thoughts from any of the panelists?
A couple thoughts on that. One is, this came up in the earlier discussions, but this national platform, this portfolio of services actually is for two audiences. One is the memory organizations, the other is the public. And actually, one of the things we really need to do in the digital world, I think, is to find a better way to have a conversation with the public, and in particular to bring materials that are held by the public into the memory organizations in a collaborative kind of a way. And Brewster, I'm picking on Brewster today a lot, but he's done so many wonderful things, gave a fabulous set of examples of how the Internet Archive has worked this with some of the music world by bringing in materials and making them available and collaborating with the bands and with the people who tape the bands. We tend to focus a lot on the material that goes through commercial channels and how to deal with that, partially because it's easy. The stuff is, I mean, it's not easy to make the arrangements we need to make, but the material is fairly well identified and moves into commercial channels. But so much of what's happening is happening beyond those sort of narrow commercial boundaries, and figuring out how to have that conversation and how much of it should be local and how much of it should be facilitated through some sort of a national service are just central problems right now. But those things, if we can solve them, will make a real difference on the ground to the public in a short period of time.
I mean, I think one of the things is, public libraries have a fabulous public library network, and every public library branch should make visible digitization and preservation. It should make visible to local public library users what is actually going on.
I'll just wanted to echo what Cliff was saying there. I think what are the problems that your community has that actually don't look like library problems? Might be another way of thinking about this. I think last Friday the Personal Digital Archiving Conference was held in New York City. Mm-hmm. This is a problem every one of us in this room has, right? We don't, all of us, in spite of what our jobs may be, we're not necessarily good stewards of our own material, our own life in digital form. And I do think there are roles that libraries, public libraries, can play in helping communities with that. So I would just kind of echo that and the shout out to Brewster and the way of bringing in personal material into the libraries, library and actually museum community too. Not just an afterthought there. I think there's a lot of very interesting work about community community life that can be brought forward in a museum context as well. So.
Just to pick up on that a little more, I happened to be at the Personal Digital Archiving meeting the Friday and Saturday, and you heard mentioned in the welcome this work that's going on here on the DC punk scene and the way the library is trying to build up a collection and document that. And there was an extended presentation on that there. This is a, perfect kind of model of the kind of interaction that a library can have with a community to really do something significant and reach people.
So hello, I'm Bradley Daigle from the University of Virginia, and I wanted to follow up and expand a little bit on, I think, Mike's excellent points about restricted access, and I think turn the question a little bit around and start having us think about nuanced access rather than restricted access, because there's a knee-jerk response to the word restricted, and what we're really talking about is having a nuanced access so the appropriate people have access in the appropriate ways. And one of the main elements that I'm seeing as another use case that's causing me a significant amount of heartburn is this culture of risk mitigation, where you have organizations who are taking the physical media that are producing today, tomorrow's art, creative, any kind of creative expression, and they are turning to solutions of risk mitigation such as grinding the computers down, rather than allowing them to ever find their ways into archives, unless you're a very good personal steward, which, again, admittedly, most are not. But that kind of data is lost, so we need environments, nuanced environments, where we can put materials that we don't even know if they're restricted or not, or nuanced in any way, but we have to park them somewhere where they can be preserved, and they can be held in some kind of stewarded environment that when we do have the resources to get to them, we can in the most appropriate way. But right now, we're lacking both the policy and the methodology to do that across any of these ecosystems. So it's happening a lot in isolation, but I think the collective loss is going to be much greater when these disk images and things that are yet remaining in inchoate form haven't had the chance to be made available.
So we've been looking really hard at the idea of a password-protected access for scholars. So if they find an item on our website that they are interested in, that is digitized or not digitized, that they want access to, that we allow access to that singular scholar for a given amount of time under a password. But copyright law doesn't exactly allow us to do that. So our legal team is constantly looking at it, and trying to figure out what we can and can't do and what the risk factors might be. The really interesting thing is that making a DVD of that video and sending it out to the scholar is okay. But for some reason, streaming it online, I guess potentially because of the hacking ability maybe, seems more risky. I'm not sure why, but that's a really good nut to crack, and I think if legal people voices could speak up about it, that would be really great.
Can I suggest a somewhat perhaps heretical thought that we may need, as we bring in more content, particularly commercial content, from people who need to make a living from it, that we may need to run some services similar to YouTube that provide payback to creators and artists in some monetary way for providing the access whilst things are still in copyright, and we need to come to terms. I don't think the public necessarily differentiates between seeing a video, archival video streamed on YouTube with ads versus one streamed from another site. They just want to get access to it, and in fact now getting it from YouTube. We did a great exhibition on the popular culture of the 1980s at the Powerhouse Museum where I was in Australia before I moved to New York, and a huge amount of that work that the curators did on that exhibit was with the community, but also was sourced from materials on YouTube, because that's where the stuff was. That's where the community put it, because it's where they found it easy to put, and it's also potentially where there is some payback to the rights holders.
Tom Scheinfeld. Karen, I appreciate your drawing our focus to issues of digitization. And I think audio-video is a particular problem. But I think at the very smallest organizations, even two-dimensional archival materials, getting those things digitized is still a huge problem. In working with local historical societies and stuff, I always come across, we just can't, we've got all this stuff, we can't get it digitized. And the national and even state and local funding organizations sort of made a joint decision, late 90s, early 2000s, that, we're not going to fund digitization anymore. Like, we are not going to fund mass digitization. And that was, I think, a good decision for the time. The rationale was that this should become part of the operating budget of the institutions, that this should be rolled into just the normal annual budget, the operating costs of the institutions. And that was smart. Problem is, hasn't happened, right? So we've been 10 years, and it's not true everywhere, but in a lot of institutions, there is no operating budget for digitization. And we've been 10 years without grant funding for it, expressly for it. And you can, and I've done plenty of this, you can work in digitization into, your budget by other means, through funding for projects and things. But I do think there's a gap there between just money for just that, very boring kind of rote work of getting things digitized at all levels, up to a big audio-video archive like WGBH, but down to the photography collections of the local historical society. So I'm wondering how a digital platform, and maybe it's not a technological solution, but maybe it's a social solution, how the National Digital Platform and the funding agencies that support it can help with that gap between our kind of expectation that this will just become part of the function of institutions and the reality that it, for a lot of institutions, hasn't happened.
Tom and others on the panel, what role might transparency play in that process? One of the things that I wonder about as I'm hearing you talk, Tom, is how visible are those libraries that are making it, or libraries, archives, and museums that are making some of these digital functions a part of their budget, and how much are we sharing that information between institutions so that we can see ways of making this possible? Is there room to study that? Is there room for some transparency around that might help?
Well, I think actually, first off, I think you're basically right. There was this assumption that it would be part of the standard operating budget, and then never happened in many, many institutions, especially public ones. There are a couple things that I want to mention. One is there is a little help on the way, I think, in terms of the things like the Hidden Collections program that CLEAR is moving ahead with, which now is reorienting to include digitization as well as description. And I think that's a significant step, and getting more resources behind that would be very desirable. But there's another thing that's starting to happen, which is I've seen a number of institutions, notably Indiana University and the New York Public Library, who are starting to do analyses of their digitization problem, often with particular emphasis on material that is really imperiled. So there's both an access and a preservation side to it. And trying to get a price tag on really dealing with the problem. Once you do that, I think you can fundraise for components of it, and it becomes a sort of a finite thing with a genuine deliverable. It's not just, fundraise into our operating budget, help support us, but if we can raise this much money, we can preserve and make available this collection, and we can even attach to it a list of the people who paid to help make it available. And I have not historically seen a lot of fundraising for targeted digitization, but I think that we're starting to approach an inflection point there, perhaps.
Can I point to one relevant example of that, which is happening right now in digital news, which is that the University of North Texas has just partnered with NBC5, their local affiliate, And they've brought in not only a collection, they're kind of pioneering on a couple of different levels. They're making sure that the donation agreement actually gives access rights embedded in that agreement, and they're planning on making those agreements public so that others can hopefully model after it. But the other really important thing that they're doing there is they are engaging in fundraising, and the news channel is actually helping them do that. And it's been a really important example that's just come up in the last couple of months, and it's worth everybody paying a little bit of attention to. They've already raised enough money to digitize a tremendous amount of the content that they're acquiring from this NBC Universal affiliate, KNX5, I think is what it's called.
This will not be a particularly original idea, but I think thinking for a second about the DPLA hubs model, right? The model of aggregation of content, or metadata at least, from within a particular geographic space that then feeds back up into DPLA. It strikes me that those libraries that have had capacity and have invested in the ability to digitize collections have done it primarily for the benefit of their collections. And there has not been a move beyond what I think the Internet Archive attempted to do in the last decade to really kind of create what I would think of as more as regional scanning facilities or cooperatively owned scanning facilities. And that's going to be so critical when it comes to the issues of audio video, right? And I think I might in fact be wrong, so someone's waving at me over here. So.
Can I give a very quick shout out to the great state of, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which has the Digital Commonwealth, which has digitizing facilities, both a Brewster Lab, as it was called in the day, to digitize books,
Right.
and the Fancy Lab, which would digitize all types of materials. And they began trying to digitize for any institution in the state. They got funding to do that. They said, you can send us up to 5,000 objects, and we'll do it for you for free. Then they figured out that nobody knew how to create the metadata to do that,
Right.
to get their stuff ready. So they started using mobs of students from Simmons, from the Gislis school there, which they called metadata mobs, that would drive out to the Calvin Coolidge archive, sit down, crack open an Excel spreadsheet, and say, this is how you digitize, this is how you start creating metadata. They didn't do it for them. They didn't train them in a classroom. They sort of showed them. And that worked. And they were so successful that several of the small institutions that used to hate the massive Boston Public Library that soaked up all of those state resources was how the little institutions
Right.
viewed those big institutions back in the day. They became believers, and they started talking to their legislators and saying, we love this place. Please support this project. So they now have a separate funding line in the state budget that has nothing to do with state funding for libraries, that is specifically to support that kind of statewide digitization. Now, maybe it works because it's a small geographic area, and you have a public library with a public mission that is also a research library, so it made sense for them to have these digitization facilities. I'm just saying this is something that we're also very interested in and want to hear more about. Thanks.
They need to do media. They need to be able to service media digitization too.
Hands over here. And over
So
here.
I think I have the microphone now.
Yes.
I'm Deanna Markham from Ithaca SNR, and I'm really responding to Tom's comment because it raised an important issue for me. We expect so much of our funding agencies, and they can do a lot, have done a lot, but it's also up to us as leaders of organizations to transform them and not just keep adding on activities, but thinking a little bit about what do our users actually need. So what should be our priorities now? If digitization of our collections is a huge priority for our communities or user groups, we should be finding ways to make that a priority for our operations and not think that we'll always have to go finding new money. We have to rethink the way we do our jobs, my plea.
And this is Jack Martin, the director of the Providence Public Library, and I had a response to Tom too, because as he was talking and all these conversations about funding for digitization, funding to make all these services visible. If you think about how much money public libraries spend every year supporting the publishing cycle, I mean, if we took like 1/4 of that money and put it towards something like this, I mean, we could easily jumpstart something off the ground. But I personally feel that public libraries spend so much time and not just buying books, but like moving books through the system and moving books around that we don't have the bandwidth to do anything else. So we have to figure that out.
I think you're next.
Hi, this is Brett Bobley from the NEH. First of all, if anyone needs money for digitization, just meet me near the coffee table after this, and I'll cut you a check. I wanted to note, Cliff, I liked your recasting of the National Digital Platform as a National Digital Portfolio, and I'm happy if we want to rename it, I can start saying National Digital Portfolio. I wanted to talk about gaps for a minute, because I think that's really important. You know, it's interesting how a lot of people have pointed out that they're really excited about this new Hydra in a Box project that's happening. It seems like that's an example where everyone knew that there was this gap there, and now it looks like some key players are working together to try to fill that gap. And it seems to me that, you know, today on this panel, you guys have surfaced a number of gap areas that we could work on. But it would be really cool, now maybe this is just because I'm a funder and I think this way, but it would be really cool if we could have a convening, maybe led by CNI or DLF or something, to actually create like a hit list. Like, here are the top 10 things that the National Digital Portfolio needs to work on. Here are the top 10 gaps. So that way we can kind of spark everyone's imagination. We can get teams of people working on those, and the funders can get together and say, you know what, we're really interested in making grants that attack one of these top 10 priorities that the community as a whole has worked together to identify. But in a more specific way, like we actually can say, oh, this is looking at item number 7. Let's see how we can attack that. That would be an interesting next step, I think.
There are a lot of models in kind of the social realm right now in sociology, business, economics, especially on the kind of social good side, that describe things that are very similar to that basically take an arc approach to, you know, establishing a direction for the field and really, you know, figuring out how to use tools and facilitation to drive some decisions at the field level, and then create ways of measuring progress towards those goals on the part of all of the different people that are involved in the system. And then the funders are able to use that as part of their roadmap for funding. I think that's a really encouraging picture that you're painting for us right now.
Todd Carpenter with the National Information Standards Organization. So many great ideas and thoughts coming out of this panel. I had trouble focusing on just one, but I will take it chronologically and go back to Catherine, your point at the start of this. As someone who grew up in Rochester, New York, where Kodak was based, a company that forgot the business that it's involved in. What is the key business that libraries and archives and museums are involved in? What is the problem space that we're trying to solve here? Is it discovery? Is it delivery of content? Is it preservation? And understanding what the core mission is will help address some of the needs and the what the implications of this platform will have to be.
Absolutely. Any ideas on the panel?
I tend to think of the role of the library, the ones that I've worked in, to facilitate the creation of new knowledge. Right? I think to me that was the business I was in, and the work that I was doing to develop services, to fund digitization, to create metadata, et cetera, it was all in the aim of helping users do something with that stuff and create something new out of it. So for me, that does not help necessarily bring back to some very specific issues, right? But I do think that's the core business, and that's why I think one reason why probably IMLS is not talking strictly about National Digital Platform, but also talking about STEM and talking about other issues elsewhere in the country on this. So.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's basically right, although I'd broaden it a little bit. It's really about the stewardship of culture and knowledge both access to historical and current, culture and knowledge, and the facilitation of creating new things in those areas. And I think it's very important to recognize that it spans, a very substantial range of human activity when you look at archives, museums, and libraries. I think there has been a bit of a tendency, particularly in the library world, to view it as something that is that is largely symbiotic with publishing. And in fact, the mission is quite a bit broader. And we're seeing, some serious rethinking of that now in various settings as, for example, research libraries in academia recognize that they're going to end up playing a significant role in the stewardship of research data, just as an example, or as we start looking at all of the largely non-commercial material that still represents a very significant expression of culture, and the fact that a great deal of that is, in danger of becoming highly ephemeral.
Any other thoughts?
Again, Michael from a bunch of places. I'm been listening this morning and watching online and watching Twitter, and I'm remembering something that Nick Poole said. He's the CEO of the Collections Trust in the UK, and back when the UK had a lot of lottery money, they did a lot of digitization. And they got done with it, and then slam, the economy fell apart. And the UK has had terrible budget cuts to the cultural sector, 30% cut to the museum budgets.
Horrible.
And what's that? Higher?
Really horrible.
Yeah, horrible, horrible, horrible. And Nick observed, and Nick is one of the biggest proponents of digitization that I've met. And he observed that we spent £285 million digitizing, but we didn't create any value for the public. Mm-hmm. And when the apocalypse came, the public, not surprisingly, wasn't there to back us up.
Right.
And I'm also thinking about, so that's a public-driven change model there. Another aspect of it is I'm aware of a big institution in the Northern Hemisphere that has a very ambitious digitization program, over $1 million to digitize a big collection, but they can't convince their own staff that it's worth working on. They can't get the registrars, they can't get the art handlers, they can't get the kind of rank and file staff to believe that it's worth improvising or changing or kind of coming in the morning and solving those problems. And that's another kind of user who has to believe in this, ultimately. And then I'm also thinking about something that Brewster told me once, and I proposed a drinking game online that every time someone mentions Brewster today, we should take a shot. And the consensus is that we can't possibly keep up with that. I'd like to try. But Brewster said, kind of as a bottom line, and I repeat this in almost every talk I give, that without users, our shelves are empty at the Open Library. And that's kind of the litmus test. When I see organizations and platforms and movements that survive all of the horrible ambiguities it takes to bootstrap something, it's the ones that have that eye-level relationship with their real users every day and who kind of live or die by that are going to weather the inevitable storms that come with trying to start something new. I could probably turn that into a question, but I probably shouldn't. Thanks.
It's a really helpful comment, and just bridging it back to the conversation we've been having here, it really does come back to what is the mission, and how are users factored into that mission, and who's missing from the conversation. And even looking around this room today, there are groups that are missing today, and one of those groups is significantly the user community. And I don't know how to mend that. I don't know how you bring in, the public figures to speak to what they want from libraries, archives, and museums. But I will at least remark that it is a bit problematic that we're all coming into this environment without that group kind of front and center in our conversation.
Yeah, I think it's only possible at the local level. Yeah. I think it's most effective at the local level, and I would suggest that perhaps we need to think about balancing digitisation of the collections we have with the efforts to collect the digital-born materials and services that we should have from the present, because we will never get a chance to get those back in the future. And those aren't necessarily covered by copyright or just copyright, but by license agreements and complex system structures that are not easy to replicate. So I would caution against spending all the money and resource on digitising the past and forgetting that the present is probably more relevant to our existing users right now.
Well, and coming back to the gaps in the national digital capacity, I wonder again where Karen was going with all of her remarks, a lot of her remarks around digital preservation. And so that responsibility level of having the capacity to handle what we're digitizing or to handle what we're bringing in a born digital fashion as well. Sorry, Cliff, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was really just going to underscore what Sebastian was saying. I think we need to be careful with our language here because we tend to talk about digitization, and that puts a very large focus on what's essentially retrospective digitization of existing collections. Now, there are some cases where those collections have major physical problems, and dealing with that basically is going to be a driver for digitization in the very short term. But I think that what we're seeing and what we really need to deal with now is as much a challenge of born digital material coming at us from every angle as just looking at these massive physical collections, some of which are okay, and probably can stay as physical collections just in terms of, priorities for limited resources.
I know I'm standing between you and lunch, but as we look at the gaps, I think it's important, and Maura made me think of this as well. I think we need an inventory of what's going on at the local level. I mean, I'm in Connecticut. I'm Ken Wigan at Connecticut State Library. We have a lot of things going on. We're taking in user content. We're experimenting and all these things state by state. And as I represent the chief officers, I think that's something that the state librarians could help with, whether it's with our historical societies or local museums. There's been a lot of talk about how we can help these folks. There's a lot going on, and I think we need to get a better understanding of what is going on and then what's holding those projects back, or where is there more synergy that can be created, and how do we do that? But until we really have a good inventory of what's going on out there, I think we're going to be, not addressing the issue quite the way we could.
So that goes back to an earlier comment, I think in the last panel, about scanning the perimeter. Right, and I think that in identifying gaps, it's very likely that there are gaps that folks are trying to meet at the perimeter that are not yet full-blown central or core solutions. Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point.
Sorry, Kara Van Malsen again at AV Preserve. I agree with a lot of what's being said about the need to focus on born digital. But also the digitization point is really important, especially what Karen brought up. And I want to reiterate, I don't think everybody is taking this seriously, that magnetic media is disappearing very rapidly. And those projects that were mentioned about from New York Public Library, Indiana University, those were AV-focused projects because they recognized the risks, they took stock of what they had, and they've made plans to move forward. Experts agreed a couple of years ago that we had about 2 years ago, that we had about 15 years left before it was really scalable to digitize magnetic media. So let's call that 13 years left, okay? So we don't have a lot of time, and getting all that done is not going to happen overnight. We really, really need awareness of this. We need to stop digitizing paper right now. We need to focus on magnetic media because we don't have that much time. So I just want to, bang that drum a little bit louder. I want to support what Karen was just saying. I also want to point out that, for the national platform point, and how do we connect globally? In Europe, they took this on about 10 years ago under the Presto projects. They, they funded at an EU level and at national levels the digitization of their AV media. And they're still doing it, but they're much, much further along than we are. We're not Europe. We do things a little bit more, differently. But the creation of Europeana was one of the major catalysts for that effort. They said, well, we really need to get our stuff in Europeana, and Europeana pushed audiovisual with some of the other sub-projects under it, such as EU Screen, and they really got that going. I don't see that happening in this country. I don't know if there's an awareness at the national level, but we will experience major loss if we don't do something. And so I'd like to suggest to the funders that if you're going to fund digitization, fund the things that are really disappearing, that cannot be viewed with your eyeballs. Okay, so you need machines to view these things. You need the machines to play them back. You need experts to do this kind of work. We don't have that much time. There was recently a blog post about an OCLC meeting, I think. I might be misrepresenting this, but there was a little summary that said AV is a problem, but their researchers don't have that much of an interest in AV. And it was kind of shocking because most of the internet is video these days. So it's kind of ludicrous to say that there's not a strong interest in video. What's being produced and put out there by users is video. So there's obviously a strong interest in video. The problem we have is it's locked away on obsolete media in storage. Nobody even knows what they have. So if we don't do something about it, it's going to be gone. So we either accept the loss or we do something.
I think we have time for one more question or one more comment.
Mike, thank you very much for bringing up the copyright issue and restricted access to things. I love that it's also during the distributed national capacity for a reason. We've tried some things quite centrally. The Google Books project ended up with a bunch of lawsuits and stopped. It proposed what was essentially a extended collective license, a new organization that would own and control the orphans. Tomorrow, Maria Palenti will be speaking on the orphans to a congressional hearing. And thankfully, actually, as I read her statement, it didn't look like she was really trying to propose an extended collective license going forward. It comes around timing around laws and how it affects our library field. We have not fielded well in the area of law changes. And I think that we want to go forward with radical distributed capacity. I talk to many that are doing private distribution of digitized works within their campuses or whatever. They just say, well, we're just doing it and it's working. Don't tell anybody. That's happening a lot. I suggest we encourage and keep that moving forward, that we don't go and depend on a national platform for solving this for us, because I think we'll get it wrong if we do that. If we consolidate particularly the law and policy things on a couple HathiTrust looking like things, we will end up with the wrong solutions. So I'm suggesting we not do a Section 108 committee anytime soon. I suggest that we have radically decentralized approaches to the copyright issues, and by the time this stuff comes around, there's best practices that have evolved. Laws are best made in retrospective practice as opposed to in hypotheticals. And if anybody would be interested in radical decentralized approaches to this and help along those lines, I'm always game.
Great.
Can I make one comment just real quick? Yes. I think that's an excellent point. I think there's some things that you can do. Let's talk about risk management or risk willingness to take risks that you can do in a local context. The more you aggregate up the issue, the problem, right, the less likely some folks are willing to take those risks, right, because the risk becomes larger, you become a bigger target. So there is something to be said about that. On the other hand, I will also say there's also something to be said for taking big risks in a very large way and at least making some motion forward, if not in the written law, perhaps at least in the courts. So.
Great. So on that note, we will disband and go to lunch. Please join me in thanking the panelists.